We have Michael Caputo. So I got to meet Michael in 2010 during the Palladino campaign. We'll talk a lot about that. We became very close friends. I'm godfather, actually, to Michael's daughter. Mike is an extremely interesting guy. When you hear some of what we're about to go through, this is a man who's got a great deal of experience, who's been involved in politics, who's extremely capable in terms of what the political system needs, wants, and how to make that happen. So Mike was actually born in Fort Bragg, but moved to Buffalo at an early age, lived in the South Towns, joined the Army right after high school, went to UB, and then found himself involved in politics. So, Mike, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Ralph. Thanks for inviting me, and it's good that you cleared up right away why our family calls you the Godfather.
Well, look, I just am so much of an admirer of yours, Mike, and what you've been able to accomplish. But I want to start back at the, kind of the beginning. So tell me how you got involved with politics. How did that all start?
Well, the greatest politics always start with the NFL. I was raised around the Buffalo Bills Stadium in Orchard Park. I was actually in a gang there, a real gang, because if you know the stadium in Orchard Park, you know that it's kind of a hard-scrabble, blue-collar neighborhood there. I was in the Big Tree Boys, but we were really devoted Bills fans, and of course, who was our quarterback but Jack Kemp. I was absolutely disinterested in politics. I was more interested in girls and rock and roll, and especially the Grateful Dead. But when I was in the Army, Jack Kemp just out of the blue recommended me for West Point. And when I turned it down because I wanted to go to a civilian school, but I always appreciated him doing that, so I interned in his office when I was a student at UB. And everything just spun out of control from there, as you can imagine. Jack ended up running for president, and I went with him to Washington as his chief writer on his presidential campaign, and it just escalated from there, all the way to, from Jack Kemp, 88 for president. I went to work for George H.W. Bush in Washington as one of his communications advisors in 92. And, I have an Army background, and I was all over the world when I was in the Army infantry, I was really interested in international politics. In fact, at UB, my special major was in journalism and Russian studies. Wow. When the wall fell, Reagan earlier, during the Contra War, when the Reagan administration was funding the Contras in Nicaragua to fight against the communists there, I got involved in that in the summers between my semesters at UB. I would go to Nicaragua with a nonprofit down there, and I was involved in resupplying the Contra fighters with ammunition. And then I would come back to school at the Amherst campus and act like nothing happened.
Hey, Michael, this is Bob Davis. I didn't realize you were a UB graduate. I thought back in the 70s, Carl Calabrese and I were the only conservatives on the UB campus, and now you can join our group.
Well, that made three of us, right?
That's right.
It was, I really enjoyed it, though. I was on the Spectrum as one of the managing editors, and I really enjoyed it. I thought the teachers were great. I liked being challenged in the classroom, but at one point, Bob, I was just so disturbed by what I was hearing in the classroom that we brought in a chapter of what we called accuracy in academia, and that made big trouble for me at UB.
I'm sure it did. I remember the political science major at UB, and I remember, you used to have to write your essays to appease the liberal political science professors.
Yeah, I can't say that I made good grades. But there is a great professor in Western New York who really got me deeply interested in politics by convincing me that it was okay to be conservative. Dr. Albie Michaels. Albie, I don't know if you ever took him, Bob, but at UB,
the name rings a bell.
Tremendous. Yeah, and he's still teaching out there. I believe he's teaching at Buff State now. But one of the greatest professors I've ever been around in my life, a real thinker, and he attracted a small group of conservatives around him.
Well, he clearly taught you well. Look, I consider myself a Jack Kemp conservative. I think Jack Kemp is one of the stellar individuals out there who really dug deep into things, but he believed in everybody. Nobody was different than the other person. Jack would debate people that didn't believe in his beliefs. He was more than happy to debate liberals at any point in time because he knew that the conservative philosophy was the right philosophy. So, and you were there. You were there and interned in his office, and you became essentially a great writer. I've seen your work, and I know what you're capable of, and that's where the start was. Isn't that where it started?
It's true. It's true. And I'll tell you, Jack was a brutal editor. I was writing speeches as well as correspondence and statements, and he was a brutal editor, and it's that kind of training you need when you're young, especially young in politics. It's interesting. We lost Jack way too early. God bless him. All of us Kemp veterans still interact. It was Jack and his staff that really jump-started my career, because his general consultant on the '88 race was none other than Roger Stone.
That's right.
And, in '88, we went to the convention expecting Jack. He had lost the primary, but we expected he might be appointed by George H.W. Bush, 41, as vice president, and he wasn't. So I was in New Orleans with nothing to do, and I called Roger, and I said, Roger, what can I do? He assigned me to the motor pool, guys, to the motor pool in New Orleans convention, and there I got assigned as the driver for a developer from New York named Donald Trump.
Wow.
And then my life completely went out of control from there.
So you met Trump then in 1988?
Yeah, it was Roger Stone that did it to me. I blame him to this day.
Roger's there's another amazing individual. I've been lucky enough to have worked for Roger and know Roger well, and I know he's your mentor in a lot of different things.
Yeah, it's okay to say that. I'm no longer offended by that. Roger used to make fun of me in meetings. Like he'd say, "Yeah, but I'm your mentor," and then somebody in the meeting would always pipe up and say, "You're Roger's protege." Because the left would say that about me to insult me. But I took it as a point of pride because I adore Roger. He's one of my dearest friends now. And talk about a guy that's been through hell, on behalf of the president.
You talk about Jack Kemp. I met Roger Stone when Jack Kemp was running for Congress, but there's some history with respect to Jack Kemp and the Conservative Party. And I remember this. I wrote an essay on this when I was at UB. In Jack Kemp's first congressional run, I'm sure Chairman Larigo remembers this, if it were not for the conservative line, Jack Kemp would not have been elected to Congress the first time he ran.
It's true. He never forgot that either.
Yes, he didn't. He did not.
And that was a rather nascent conservative party, if you remember. You were important, but and the party was really a necessity in the primary era, right? But it really grew stronger and stronger and stronger after Jack's first election.
So I want to take a turn here for a little bit and find out a little bit about the Russian connection with Michael Caputo. So how does that all come about?
It's interesting. It was Albie Michaels, I blame him, Dr. Michaels, who interested me in Russia. I was in the 25th Infantry Division. I remember in 1982, I was in South Korea for war games. We called them, I think it was Team Spirit every year in the late winter. And I was in a foxhole on the DMZ with some of my compatriots from 25th Infantry, and somebody handed me the field glasses, and I looked across the DMZ, and there was a Russian officer at an observation point, clearly there visiting in some honorary position or whatever, who was looking through his field glasses right back at me. And I'll never forget how chilling that was. And I came back, went to college at UB, And Dr. Michaels defined for me the battle between good and evil, the battle between democracy and communism. And it was during college. I mean, I technically have a degree in Russian studies, a special major in Russian studies from UB. And so when I got to Washington, I wrote a lot about Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, for Jack. Jack talked a lot. You guys remember he was on the cutting edge of the Cold War rhetoric of the 80s. And so what Dr. Michaels taught me at UB was honed by the writing that I was doing for Jack. And in 92, when we lost the election, I was, working for George H.W. Bush, 41, and Clinton came in. I had met some Russian government officials at official dinners of the White House. One in particular was a guy named Andrei Kozyrev. He actually lives in Miami now. He was the foreign affairs minister of Gorbachev. And I met him in the White House at a state dinner. He was at my table, and I told him at the table that I was involved in something that some folks, especially in my era, remember as something we called Rock the Vote, an MTV project, because young people weren't voting, and we wanted them to be encouraged to vote by their favorite bands. We were working with Madonna and others, and I told him about that because the Russians were about to move into their first democratic era, and I explained to him that we had a similar problem. Our young people were voting, and he got very interested in Rock the Vote. So when we lost and Clinton won, and Clinton put a big package together through an organization in Washington called the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and they gave $1 billion or more to projects in Moscow. Kozyrev turned around and he said, I want to do Rock the Vote Russia, and I want Michael Caputo to come. And, of course, the Clinton people didn't want to bring in a staffer for their opponent. They resisted. But eventually I went. I was supposed to go for a year, and I stayed for almost 7 years.
In Russia?
In Russia. I lived in Moscow. I came back and forth to Buffalo to visit family. But in the end, I was there for a couple of years without going home because I finally figured out that Moscow was only a 2-hour flight from the most interesting cities in Europe. So instead of going to Buffalo to see my family, I'd go to Milan or Paris and things like that. But, I always tell the left, who hates me so much, especially in Buffalo and especially in East Aurora, they would accuse me of being a Russian spy. My first line back to them was, why don't you get a passport and see the world? If you don't understand what it's like to want to live and work overseas, then I don't really understand that mentality. I was in Russia the first year. I wrote, with the assistance of experts, of course, the first draft of the Russian election law. And then we wrote the first draft of the state of Moscow and the state of St. Petersburg election law. And in doing that, I worked directly with Russian officials. In St. Petersburg, I worked with the deputy mayor. His name was Putin. I think you've heard of him. And Vladimir Putin was the deputy mayor, and he was in charge of Western relations. So I had to co-chair election law conferences with Vladimir Putin, and he would just sit there quietly after making a glib speech and just kind of look at me like I had a third eye. After my time at USAID ended, I actually got into a bit of an argument with USAID because they were getting way too involved in the elections, and they were doing something that I considered to be meddling in the elections. They were actually giving money. The USAID was giving money that would end up in the hands of political candidates.
So, Mike, you spent 7 years in Russia, and then you came back, I understand, and Roger Stone convinced you to go to Florida, and you opened up your own public relations company. Is that what happened?
Yes, it is. And, I came back in 2000 because I was home in the United States on the beach in Palm Beach, actually right out in front of Mar-a-Lago. And I got the news with my friends who were also in town from Russia that Putin was appointed president on New Year's Eve. And I looked at my friend and I said, I'm packing my stuff. I went back and packed up my things and moved back and moved down to Florida, where Roger had invited me to help participate in some of his clients and get my life restarted in the United States. And I some of my friends know this, especially Dave DiPietro, who's been out on it. I bought a tugboat and moved on board with a parrot named August West. Anybody who's a Grateful Dead fan knows who August West is. And I lived there writing and just growing my hair and my, never putting on shoes, and was consulting from there and mostly ghostwriting. It was an interesting experience that helped me kind of recover from being in Russia for a long time. I didn't even really speak all that much Russian, and it was, a wild time. And I went from that to living quietly with a parrot on a boat in Florida, a complete contrast. But it was during that time when I met my wife, Marina, who you know well. You're the godfather here in our family. And Marina and I worked together on a campaign in Ukraine. I was, Roger called me up from Ukraine. He said, Michael, I've got some things going on here. I need you to come over. And I agreed to do that as long as I didn't have to cut my hippie hair. And I met my wife. She was my translator, and everything improved from there. In fact, when we got married, we moved back to Buffalo and eventually sold that boat. I do miss the tugboat. But, that's when I met you, because Roger talked me into joining the Palladino campaign.
Okay, so look, like you say, I certainly know Marina. What a beautiful, beautiful woman she still is. I can imagine what she looked like when you first met her and everything. And she's just a good person. So let's get into the Palladino campaign. That was when I did meet you. You came back. You were here in Buffalo. How did it come about that you and Carl got together for this?
Well, Carl was introduced to Roger Stone, and Roger became the general consultant, and I was, living out in East Aurora, which is, I consider my hometown. We miss it very much. And Roger said, have you heard of this guy Palladino? And I'd only been home for, a matter of months, 2 months maybe, and I hadn't. So I came into Ellicott Square building to visit Carl, and it struck me, everything is, life just repeats itself. My father, Ray Caputo, has an agency an insurance agency called the Wolf Agency. It's now over 100 years old, and he had the headquarters of Wolf Agency in a building called the Ellicott Square building.
Right.
And when I was a kid during visitation, because my parents were divorced, I would hang around the Ellicott Square building, causing trouble mostly, because my dad is too busy selling insurance to watch me down in that beautiful lobby of the Ellicott Square building, trying to slide away with a chocolate bar from the snack table there. And I got caught doing that once. I think I might have been 10, 11 years old, by Carl himself. And he grabbed my ear with his hands. You know how we used to be allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And led me out the door by my ear, and he said, don't come back. And but I did come back. I came back to meet him for his campaign 20 years later, or actually 28 years later. And I just love Carl. He has a lot of the same ideas that I do, the same ideas that Roger does, the Conservative Party does. I'm also very much like Carl in my demeanor, and we got along really, really well. We had this great guy with us who was always, he was his body guy, it was just, a wonderful experience, a great way to get back into the community, and you were really an important part of it and a key advisor to Carl as he ran for governor. We never thought we would win the primary. It was really quite a victory. So
it was a very interesting ride. I can remember when I first heard on the radio that Carl Palladino was thinking of running for governor. I hear it on the radio. I give him a call. I've known Carl for decades. We've been friends. I give him a call and say, Carl, what are you doing? And so He tells me he's going to run on the Tea Party. That's how he plans to do it. I say, well, Carl, you can't do it that way. We end up having dinner that same night. He wants me to go to dinner. We have dinner. I'm trying to talk him out of running for governor while every single person in that restaurant comes up to him, pats him on the back, and says, Carl, we're with you. Carl, you're the guy for us. They came out of the kitchen, every single person. So at the end of that meeting, everything turned around, and Carl said, okay, we're going to New York. So I had told him we'd have to go to New York. We'd have to meet Mike Long, the then conservative chairman, and Ed Cox, who was the Republican chair, and we'd have to have those lines in order to be successful. And that's how it all started. We end up going to New York. I meet you, although Rick Lazio's in the way. And
Right.
then tell us what happened from there.
Well, I do want to take a moment and mention somebody who was really missed, and that's Russ Thompson. He was a part of that whole Tea Party effort to
He certainly was.
recruit Carl, and he passed away recently, and I
Yes.
think of him often. He was a great guy, and really a strong supporter, not just of Carl, but of President Trump. A really great guy. Anyway, I don't want to get too maudlin about it because it makes me sad to think of that, but because he died way too young. But Carl he was colorful. That's the way to put it, and he would speak in an unfiltered manner. And the one thing that really struck me and really made me want to work for him was this whole idea that Roger encouraged, that I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Remember that?
Yes, I certainly do.
I do. Yep.
Yeah, he said that, I think, on a radio show or something, and he got a bunch of crap for it, and which made me think that was a perfect thing to run on. And if you remember, his orange and black signs even said "mad as hell" on them.
That's right.
And it wasn't mad as heck. I remember the debate over that in the Ellicott Square building, headquarters of his campaign. Heck or hell, heck or hell. Remember? And it was during that. Now, he lost in blue New York in the general election. It was hard to win at that time. It's even harder now. The Republicans who win statewide in New York have typically been more liberal, or at least more moderate. And Carl was about as conservative as they got.
But I remember those days. I remember the baseball bat. We had the baseball bat that Carl had with him all the time. I remember how many times you and I and Carl were in a car together, and Russ Thompson driving around in New York. I certainly remember the conservative convention that year when Mike Long decided to go first before the Republicans to push Rick Lazio. And so I had been talking to a number of our county chairs and talked about Carl. They were not satisfied with Lazio. There were a number of people. And what had happened was they were going to have a straw man, someone who would run, a lawyer who would run on the conservative line so that we could take the line back and give it to Carl if Carl were to win the Republican primary. And so I go to the convention, and I say, so where's the guy who's going to run for governor? And they say, well, he didn't show up. What are we going to do? We want you to run. You want me to run for governor? So I remember calling Roger Stone saying, Roger, they want me to run for governor. And Roger says, that's great. That's fantastic. Then I called my wife and said, Deb, they want me to run for governor. I can't tell you exactly what she said because we're on the radio, but she said, are you crazy? What are you talking about? And so what happened was I would have needed 25% of the vote in order to be in the primary. I actually got 42% of the vote, to Mike Long's dismay. And so I became the conservative, I became a candidate in the conservative primary that year. And you helped me. I had, a fundraiser at Carl's brother's house. You wrote a lot of interesting things for me. It was an interesting year.
Yeah, it was. I'll tell you, so much has come from that era. Isn't that right? I mean, and a lot of people don't. I just want to mention one thing. Remember, people are like, don't say heck, don't say hell, say heck. You know, Carl, you have to tone it down. It really reminds me of the President of the United States, and it's really quite an interesting story. But how they're actually quite related. But I want to say, at his announcement, people were like, "Don't use the bat, don't use the base," because I remember Carl got in trouble for saying something on the radio about sometimes you just have to take the bad guys out with a baseball bat, and they're like, he's violent, etc. And he had this baseball bat, and there were people on the campaign who were like, Carl, you have to calm down the rhetoric. And he was giving his announcement speech in the lobby of the Ellicott Square, and he had told me, he says, Michael, I want you to bring me the baseball bat at the end of my speech. And I said, oh, no, no, Carl, people are going to get upset. He said, get ready. And at the end of his speech, he looked over at me, and I'm shaking my head, like, maybe not, Carl, maybe not. And he's like, bring it with his hand. He's like, bring it. I'm like, maybe not, maybe not. And so I just did it.
Mike, I
handed him the baseball bat, and history was begun.
I had lunch with Carl a week ago, Mike, and he looks great, and he hasn't lost his passion.
Not at all.
Carl, Carl started the whole Trump thing. I mean, Carl started a campaign that Trump just amplified. There's no question about it. I'm mad at hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. That is the way conservatives feel about how Democrats have made this sharp turn to the left. And Carl started it here in New York, and it was amazing to everybody what happened in that primary. So tell us, in terms of the numbers of the defeat of Lazio in that Republican primary in Erie County, Carl won by 93% of the vote.
Yes.
Something that's never happened before and presumably will never happen again.
Never happen again.
It's true, but that's the passion that Carl brings. And if you know Carl, like Erie County knows Carl, there is passionate. If you know Carl, you're passionate about him, right? And
that's right.
So I was sorry about the defeat in the general. Carl took it, really well. He said, we've started something, Michael. And then, I went, I guess that was 2010. And 3 years later, something happened. And I don't know if a lot of people remember, most people don't know this, but there's this little diner on Route 16 outside of East Aurora called Kipps Diner, Kipps, which has a motorcycle on a platform out in front as its sign. There are so many tiny diners around the United States that were the places where, conservatives would talk kind of quietly in hushed tones during the Obama era about how much they missed the America they once knew. And that kind of went on at Kipps, and people like, Dave DiPietro hung out there. It wasn't just bikers and farmers. It was, Carl Palladino would come there at times because it was a great place to just talk and an excellent breakfast and really tremendous spot. But one day I didn't go, and I got a call from DiPietro. He was there with the former Assemblyman Bill Noje, God rest his soul, and others. And he said, Caputo, we're sitting here talking about who should be governor. This is 2013. And we're thinking Donald Trump, and we know you know Donald Trump. Well, that grew into something a lot of people remember. Donald Trump decided, I took David and Bill and then Carl Palladino to Trump Tower to meet the president, then just a developer from New York. And Roger was trying to prepare him to run for president at the time. And I said, Roger, we'd like him to run for governor. And he said, don't you dare. But he brought me in to see the president anyway, and David and Noje and later Carl convinced him he should just take a trip around New York State and think about running for governor. And I remember sitting down with Carl and the president, then, the potential candidate, and Carl started telling him about the Mad as Hell campaign and how he harnessed the frustrations and anger of people regular Americans who think that their country is going astray and that they're losing the country they once knew, and that their children and grandchildren would never knew the country we knew. And I remember that conversation like it happened yesterday. And the president really took it to heart. I believe Carl talked to him about the Mad as Hell campaign for about a half an hour. It was really quite something. Now, in addition to that, Carl and Dave DiPietro had a Second Amendment rally at the State House in Albany in 2013 in honor of Donald Trump, and that was his first rally. And I remember talking to him after the rally, and he said, I really like that. I think this rally environment is something that we can really, use. And that time I thought he was talking about governor, right? But he was talking about president. He decided not to get in the race because the Republican Party was committed to the wrong candidate, and they wouldn't give him a shot. And so he decided to get out. And then, if you remember, he decided to buy the Buffalo Bills. And who am I? But I'm a Big Tree boy from right outside the stadium, and he knew the story about me and my gang and Chucky Sontag and Chucky's parking and all these things going on around the. And he said, Michael, can you and Nick Langworthy and Dave DiPietro help me with this? What we did was we stopped Bon Jovi from buying the team and moving it to Toronto. The president didn't end up buying. We have a great owner now because he outbid Fagula outbid the president by a lot. But the president put us to work to block Bon Jovi, and I think in a lot of ways, Nick Langworthy and Dave DiPietro had a big role in that, making sure that the team would stay. But what happened then was the presidential campaign. And
before that, though, Mike, you, myself, and Nick Langworthy went to Trump Tower to try to convince Trump to run for governor. We sat across the desk from him. I can certainly remember when the three of us went to Trump Tower. What was interesting to me when we got up to the top floor where Trump Tower is, you open the elevator and there are pictures of Trump everywhere. Throughout the building. Now, they're magazine covers, but they're pictures of Trump everywhere throughout that whole thing. And then, if you recall, we went into Trump's office, and Nick had brought a memento. He brought a buffalo. And Trump is trying to find a place to put it down, and there was really no place to put it. It was so much stuff all over the place. But that's when I realized that Trump wasn't going to run for governor at that point in time. I was there to ask him to open up a campaign bank account.
Right.
And after that, we went down and met with like 30-some county chairs from across the state, and Trump entertained every single one of them. They all loved him. He dodged the question about running for governor, and he came away still a hero in each one of their eyes.
Well, you remember the dinner at Salvatore's. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
And I'll tell you, Nick Langworthy and I have had our differences on campaigns and things back in Erie County. Two things, though. Number one, people need to understand Nick Langworthy's role in bringing Donald Trump across the finish line into active politics. And would there be a President Trump without Nick Langworthy, Ralph Larigo, Mike Caputo, Carl Palladino? Probably. But Nick's role was outsized, remember. And by the way, I was in Washington about 2 months ago. I was outside the Capitol, and here comes Nick Langworthy, and I didn't even recognize the guy. That guy's gotten into shape like totally Maha.
Yeah, he has.
He lost so much weight that I didn't even recognize him. And he looked at me, and he didn't recognize me either because I lost 120 pounds from cancer. And I'm fine now, but we both looked at each other like strangers, and we realized it was skinny Langworthy and skinny Caputo. It was really something. He's a great guy, but he had a big role, and the president's campaign in 2016 was a trip.
Well, look, Nick is an extremely capable individual. He was an extremely good Erie County chairman. He was an extremely good New York State chairman, and now he is an extremely good congressman. I expect that he will follow in the footsteps of
Jack Kemp.
Jack Kemp. He will be there for as long as he wants and move along, if he, decides to. So look, let's get back to Trump and you and Trump. So 2016, you are become an advisor to the Trump presidential campaign.
Yeah, I was a comms advisor working in the Trump Tower. And working at the convention and stuff, and it was, really a very difficult campaign, a lot of factions and things. But the American people brought Donald Trump across the finish line there, much to the shock and chagrin of Hillary Clinton, who created an absolutely false Russia hoax. And you can imagine how sexy I was to that whole narrative, since I was the only person on the planet at the time that knew both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. They had to try and create the fiction that I introduced them, if you remember that. And I remember when that first hit, Ralph, I came to you and I said, I'm in trouble. What do I do? I don't even know. And you might not remember this, but you sent me to an attorney named Dennis Bacco.
Yes.
And if it weren't for Dennis Bacco, I don't know what would have happened to my family. Because Dennis, of course, was U.S. attorney for Western New York. He knew the games they were playing. I was only a witness, but he warned me they were trying to make something out of it, and I followed his advice to the T, and I don't know what would have happened to my family without a Buffalo attorney named Dennis Bacco. I had the best attorney through the entire Russiagate scandal, better than any of the president's attorneys. And I'll tell you, I had difficulty with that. I still became Assistant Secretary of Health during COVID, which was an awful, awful job. The country was on fire. And my family was back in East Aurora being harassed by Antifa and the left. And I was in Washington working 20 hours a day. And you know what that did to me. After Russiagate and all the things they did to my family, the harassment that grew out of Russiagate because the lies empowered so many sick-minded leftists who wanted my family to die. And they certainly wanted me to die. Well, I got cancer. From the stress. I mean, it was a stress-driven cancer, and I ended up coming home to Roswell Park. And I got to tell you, so many great things come out of Buffalo. Like I said, Dennis Bacco, my daughter's godfather, Ralph Dorigo, all these wonderful things that I went through there, Carl Palladino. But one of the best things I ever went through was Roswell Park. I was a lightning rod at the time. I was Assistant Secretary of Health, a lot of crap, and I was, but Roswell Park ignored the politics, and they cured me. I can tell you, I didn't expect to be cured. It was pretty far along, and what they did for our family is comparable to what Dennis Bacco did for our family. And when I got better, I was getting so much harassment in East Aurora. My children were getting chased around by these warped, mentally ill people who hate Donald Trump so much that they'll harass children, and we left.
I can, Mike, I can remember now coming to your house, Debbie and I coming to your house, being on your porch. Dave DiPietro was there. We were there to pray for you. To pray for you. To be the cancer survivor that you did become.
Yeah, and I tell you, people would come to my house. I had groups of 10 and 15 and 20 patriots who would come in and just lay their hands on me and pray. It was really, of course, Roswell and their treatments and the work, such hard work they did to cure me. But really, my faith played a huge role, and it was tough. I'm a Catholic. I was very lapsed, as you can imagine, as a politician. Not living the biblical life. And I was right across the street from my parish, Immaculate Conception, and I couldn't attend Mass. I had to watch it on my video, on my phone, but at the end of Mass, the priest would come over and give me the Eucharist on my front porch. And I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed.
Yeah.
And I returned to my faith, which is why when the president heard about how much harassment we were going through in East Aurora, he pushed us to move where we are now. It's a town in the Everglades called Ave Maria. It's 11,000 Catholics around a beautiful cathedral and a university, Ave Maria University, where I'm in a master's for theology. Can you believe that? My friends in Buffalo who know me,
wow,
and how many Grateful Dead shows I've been to. Theology, yes, you heard it right.
Yeah.
But Ave Maria, it's like, I could describe it to you. I know we're running out of time, but it's like the Vatican without communists.
Fantastic. Look, I am so proud of knowing you, being close with you, being a godfather to your daughter. You've had an excellent, stellar career, certainly continuing. You're the best writer that I ever met. You've written for a number of important 500 CEOs. You've done a great job throughout your entire career.
Well, Ralph, the one thing I want people to know, and I think you want to take it, they should take it away from this interview, is they did what they spied on Donald Trump in 2016. We're proving that now. All the dumps and documents coming out of Tulsi Gabbard. But we discovered recently that they were spying on the 2024 campaign. And unfortunately, we announced this week that they were spying on me and my family again. The FBI was spying on the 2024 campaign. They don't stop. I think the FBI should be shattered into 1,000 pieces and scattered to the winds, Ralph. The next thing people are going to hear about is the spying on the 2024 campaign.